Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining today's Explainer. For those of us studying American political history, we are about to take a highly analytical look at a massive chronological arc. We're going to explore how the fundamental contradictions of the American founding, that jarring clash between the soaring rhetoric of liberty and the brutal reality of human bondage, echoed through centuries. We'll trace how these early constitutional tensions didn't just influence, but entirely necessitated the advanced, high-stakes strategies of the 1960s civil rights movement. So let's jump right in. Right off the bat, let's analyze this absolutely remarkable excerpt from Benjamin Banneker's 1791 letter to Thomas Jefferson. Banneker, who was a brilliant free African-American intellectual, just directly exposes the immediate hypocrisy of the Declaration of Independence. He is essentially asking Jefferson, how on earth can you write a document proclaiming unalienable rights to life and liberty while actively participating in the enslavement of human beings? It's a powerful call-out, and it really sets the baseline for the great American contradiction we're studying today. Here is our roadmap for today. We're covering 1. The American contradiction, 2. Early law and moral appeals, 3. Evolution of direct action, 4. Geopolitics and segregation, and 5. The shift to nationalism. All right, let's start with Section 1, the American contradiction. The core tension of this era is just striking. On one side of the scale, you've got these founding ideals, the rhetoric of universal liberty, constitutional freedom, this brand new democratic experiment. But directly opposing that, weighing it all down, is the economic reality. This young nation was deeply economically anchoring itself to the peculiar institution of slavery and human trafficking. To put that into perspective, by 1860, that institution was worth more than all the nation's manufacturing and railroads combined. You simply cannot understand American political history without grappling with the fact that these two radically opposing forces were baked into the foundation at the exact same time. Which brings us to a really crucial analytical question for this period. How did early American jurisprudence, meaning the courts and the lawmakers, actually attempt to untangle or perhaps codify this massive, glaring contradiction? Let's look at how that played out in Section 2, Early Law and Moral Appeals. Notice the immediate legal tug-of-war happening here between the state and federal levels. Look at the 1783 case of Quock Walker versus Jennison. This was a huge, monumental state Supreme Court decision where Walker, an enslaved man, sued for his freedom and actually won. The court declared that the principles of the new Massachusetts state constitution were inherently incompatible with slavery, effectively ending it in that state. But just 10 years later, look at the federal response. The government passes the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, establishing a strict legal requirement to return escaped enslaved persons. They literally embedded the protection of slavery deep into national federal law. So progressive state victories were almost instantly countered by regressive federal codification. And as we trace this timeline forward, we see that national divide deepening profoundly. The 1808 ban on the international slave trade changed the dynamics, sure. But then, the 1820 Missouri Compromise sparked intense political debates over the westward expansion of slavery. In response, both sides really hardened their ideological arguments. You had figures like Richard Furman in 1823 providing scriptural justifications for slavery to appease Southern churches, while on the flip side, abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison ramped up the pressure in 1829, utilizing the printing press to morally shame the institution. Now, here's a crucial takeaway. This wasn't just a Southern problem. When the international slave trade was banned in 1808, it fueled a massive, booming domestic slave trade. And northern states were absolutely not innocent bystanders here. Their financial infrastructures, specifically northern shipping companies and insurance businesses, were deeply and financially complicit in the domestic expansion of the southern plantation economy. The economic roots were completely intertwined nationwide. Moving right along to Section 3, Evolution of Direct Action. I want you to compare these two entirely different eras of activism. The early activists of the 1830s relied really heavily on moral suasion. They used religious journals, championed by free African-American voices like Jarena Lee, and visual media like the American Anti-Slavery Almanac, attempting to change hearts and minds through moral shaming. Now, fast forward to the 1960s, the strategy radically shifts. Young activists and groups like SNCC and CORE moved from the printing press to direct physical action. They were putting their own bodies on the line in student-led sit-ins and freedom rides to force physical integration and demand actual federal enforcement. These 1960s tactics were a brilliant, absolutely necessary evolution. The 1960 Greensboro sit-ins weren't just protests, right? They were calculated, targeted, economic disruptions of segregated local businesses. And the 1961 Freedom Rides? They were direct physical challenges to interstate transit laws, forcing the federal government to respond to interstate commerce violations. This organizational shift empowered a youth-led, grassroots momentum that physically pressure-tested the American legal system in a way that early moral petitions simply couldn't do. But here's an angle that often gets missed in standard history texts. Domestic activism doesn't operate in a vacuum. To fully understand this era, we have to ask, what external, global pressures finally forced the federal government to start yielding to these domestic civil rights demands in the 1950s and 60s? Let's explore that in Section 4, Geopolitics and Segregation. Look at how these global and domestic events map perfectly alongside one another. It's fascinating. In 1953, the CIA begins covert operations under Eisenhower to combat communism globally. Literally 1 year later, in 1954, the Supreme Court issues the landmark Brown v. Board of Education decision overturning separate but equal. Then in 1957, the Soviet Union launches Sputnik, triggering massive American anxiety. Domestic civil rights were suddenly deeply intertwined with matters of global perception and national security. The stark reality is that fears of global communism forced domestic civil rights concessions. As the Cold War escalated, the United States desperately needed to win the ideological war against the Soviet Union by projecting this pristine image of freedom and democracy to non-aligned nations. The U.S. simply could not claim to be the undisputed leader of the free world while actively maintaining brutal, legalized segregation and racial violence at home. It was an international public relations nightmare, and it basically forced Washington's hand. And yet, while Washington was posturing globally, domestic policies were quietly cementing segregation in entirely new ways. Take the Interstate Highway Act of 1956. On paper, it was a massive federal infrastructure project, creating a new culture on the move and spurring white suburban growth. But in practice, it fundamentally reshaped and enforced national patterns of racial segregation. City planners intentionally routed these massive concrete highways directly through thriving minority urban neighborhoods, bulldozing communities and creating physical, concrete barriers separating affluent suburbs from urban centers. In many cities, these highways didn't just accidentally run through minority neighborhoods. They were strategically weaponized as slum clearance tools, meaning the infrastructure itself became a permanent tool of segregation. Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, the shift to nationalism. You see, the advent of television fundamentally altered the political playing field in America. The 1960 Nixon-Kennedy debates proved that visual media could instantly dictate political reality. And for the civil rights movement, television created living room wars. It brought the brutal, violent realities of Southern segregation directly into the living rooms of the American public. When campaigns like the 1964 Freedom Summer voter registration drives were met with violent resistance, the television optics made complacency absolutely impossible for the broader white middle class. The whole world was literally watching. By the mid-1960s, a profound philosophical divergence emerged within the movement. On one hand, you had the philosophy of nonviolent integration, primarily advocated by Martin Luther King Jr., which focused heavily on domestic civil rights, desegregation, and economic inclusion, highlighted by the massive March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. But emerging alongside this was Black nationalism, powerfully articulated by Malcolm X. He provided a militant alternative, shifting the focus towards self-defense, self-determination, and brilliantly reframed the struggle not just as a domestic civil rights issue, but as a global human rights issue, connecting it to anti-colonial movements worldwide. So as we wrap up this historical arc, look at the sheer scale of the evolution here. In the early republic, activists fought the constitutional contradictions of slavery with moral petitions and printed almanacs. But by the mid-1960s, fighting that deeply entrenched systemic oppression required radically escalated strategies, mass physical mobilization, the leverage of television optics, and a shift toward militant self-determination. We can really see how the very same contradictions of the 1780s ultimately required the highly sophisticated, forceful strategies of the 1960s to finally break. I'm going to leave you with this final, provocative thought for your own continued research. As you look at modern political divides, and as you literally drive on our urban infrastructure today, where do you still see the echoes of the early republic's original contradictions? Because let me tell you, the concrete poured in 1956 and the legal precedents set way back in 1793 are still very much beneath our feet today. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep analyzing, keep questioning, and I'll see you next time.